Hello and welcome to Charities, Their Nature and Purpose. My name is David Gilchrist and I'm co-convener of Not-for-Profits UWA. This podcast is a replication of a public lecture I gave at UWA Business School on the 27th of June 2019. The lecture had the same title. The lecture was also part of the Morgan Stanley UWA Business School Not-for-Profit Events series, and we'd like to take this opportunity to thank Morgan Stanley for their ongoing support in delivering events to the not-for-profit sector that we think are absolutely critical for the future of the sector. We'd also like to identify, acknowledge and thank the West Australian Council of Social Service, WACOSS. WACOSS has been a big ongoing supporter of the UWA work into not-for-profits and charities. We're very pleased to be able to team up with WACOSS once again to deliver this particular lecture. So, charities, their nature and purpose. In many respects, charities and not-for-profit organisations have been around in Australia and a significant part of the community since the inception of the first colony. However, we are at a decision point. Current government policy, current funding arrangements, and generally the current commentary leads us to think that perhaps it's even time to ask whether or not we want these kinds of organisations. Why do I say that? I think a number of things lead me to be asking this particular question. Firstly, quasi-market economics is an enduring element of our public policy environment. Our myth of power of markets and our expectation that market arrangements will somehow deliver resources that are going to support some of the most vulnerable people in our community is really quite amazing. And I think that at the end of the day, a lot of organisations and a lot of public policy people are reacting to quasi-market economics in a way that's not necessarily going to mean that charities and not-for-profits are going to be sustainable going forward. I'll return to this point shortly. We also have inconsistent economic narratives. We often talk about the charitable and not-for-profit sector and the services that they provide as fiscal sinks for state, territory and the Commonwealth governments. We think that we need to reduce the amount of money that we're paying, and we're always concerned about the impact on the public purse for these organisations. That impact is of course important and it can be substantial. It's something that we shouldn't leave or not think about. But at the end of the day too, I think it's really important to recognise that charities and not-for-profit organisations are great employers and great economic drivers, and we need to be more consistent in our economic narratives around the opportunities that exist in this particular sector. We also need to think about, from a policy perspective, how we currently focus on the microeconomic view. This goes hand in hand with the inconsistent economic narratives that I've just been talking about, but where we think about individual organisations and think in terms of prices rather than thinking about the institution of not-for-profits and charity, particularly in relation to human services, and the broader impacts on all of those organisations. To be sure, there's always a spectrum of organisations from good to bad. It doesn't matter what sector you're involved in. And to be sure, some organisations won't provide services very well, perhaps not efficiently, perhaps not effectively. But the vast majority of organisations are efficient and effective, but more importantly, we need to take a policy framing view or focus on the macroeconomic use of this sector and how we can be more efficient and how we can drive that sector more effectively. We often think about the not-for-profit sector as in terms of its commercial, equating it with commercial entities. And I think this is also a very poor idea. What we really need to do is decide whether or not-for-profits and charitable organisations are fit for purpose for what they actually do, not whether they're replicating or similar to other organisations that actually do vastly different things within our community. We also see an increase in advocacy restrictions, whether through government activity or through self-restriction or stopping ourselves from advocating as organisations, which is also being replicated in a growing lack of political courage. At the end of the day, charities and not-for-profit organisations have a responsibility for advocating for systems and advocating for individuals. And this is a really important outcome if that advocating is restricted. There's an inability of governments and the sectors to work together. There's a distinct lack of trust, and a lot of policy is focused around that lack of trust. I guess at the end of the day, too, it's really important to acknowledge that when we talk about charities and not for profit organisations, when we talk about being at a decision point or whether we want these organisations or not, we also have to recognise that the public sector has had a history of not investing sufficiently in its own capacity to be able to deal with charities and not for profit organisations. Indeed, there is a lack of investment in the public sector to drive policy implementation, and this impacts the ability of charities and not for profits to do the work they do. In terms of inconsistent economic narratives, I think there's a number of things that we need to consider. As you can see in this bubble, in 2017, mining turned over about $217 billion Australian. The charities alone, so just the charities sector, turned over $146 billion in the same year. This information on charities is from the latest ACNC Australian Charities Report for 2017. When we think about employment, so the economic narrative being much more consistent, then in 2017 the mining sector had about 240,000 employees, so almost 250,000. On the other hand, charities returned ACNC data to say that they had about 1.25 million employees. And therefore, if we're thinking about being consistent in our economic narratives, it's very easy to see that it's important for public sector financial policy and economic policy to use the not-for-profit charitable sector to drive the Australian economy. The same way as it's important for the mining and other sectors to do that. But 1.26 million employees is a very significant proportion of the employees that are employed in Australian industry. Some of the other things to be aware of as well in relation to that economic narrative, less than half of the income of these organisations come from government. In other words, they raise or trade to generate the income that they use for the services that they provide. And as I've said before, a lot of those services are often to some of Australia's most vulnerable people. Only 6.7% of that income comes from donations, and these organisations also deploy about 3.3 million volunteers in 2017. So again, in terms of economic driving, this is a sector that we should really be watching and creating policy to be able to leverage for economic consistency going forward. In terms of their nature though, so to return to the title of this particular lecture, Charities, Their Nature and Purpose, of course I could come back to things like the Statute of Elizabeth, the Australian Charities Act, or we could talk about the tax legislation and regulations, and we can also talk about the associations legislation. These are all things that probably most people listening to this podcast have heard of or considered, even if they perhaps don't know the nuances of all of the elements that impact charities and not-for-profits in this legislative framework. For my money though, I really want to sidestep these kinds of elements and start talking about taking an institutional perspective. So a perspective on the entire institution of the charitable and not-for-profit sector rather than the individual organisations or the legalistic challenges that might come out of some of these statutes and arrangements. An institutional perspective is very important because it ascribes value to the whole system. It allows us to look at a systemic level of policy and practice rather than individual organisations. It recognises that the sector is a national asset, one that's not easily replaceable. It's a national infrastructure, and it has intellectual property and significant experience, all of which it brings to bear in delivering services that we all value in our community. Indeed, this is an institution that's irreplaceable. Now, I must say that I'm not here to be an apologist for individual charity and not-for-profit organisations, and I certainly don't suggest that charities and not-for-profits that are inefficient and ineffective should automatically survive just because of the nature of their organisations. But we can't take an individual view. We've got to take an institutional view of this entire sector to ensure that we're not destroying the system that we have. It is irreplaceable. Indeed, the sector is an important part of the whole. What of mission? And we often talk about mission in these kinds of organisations and in relation to this discussion. Mission is, of course, important. It has a philosophical purpose. It helps to drive what we do. It has a communication purpose too, both within the organisation and externally to stakeholders. But the thing about mission is, everyone actually has one. Even BHP has a mission. So for me, and in relation to this lecture, mission is relevant, but it's not relevant to this discussion. What is more relevant is the practicalities around looking at the not-for-profit and charitable sector in an institutional perspective. Indeed, we need to think about what they actually do. What do charities and not-for-profits do? Well, if we think about the lack of attention to institution and the idea of what these organisations do, as governments have pushed service delivery away from their activity into the not-for-profit charitable sector, and as incidentally they've moved risk into that sector as well, gradually they've lost an understanding of service delivery. They've lost an understanding of all of the nuances and impacts and ways of thinking about service delivery so that that service delivery can be effective. Indeed, when you talk to funders, they think they buy things like the services that they're procuring and also the administration and coordination process. But often those funders, and indeed often ministers and policymakers, also think that for-profit organisations can be the same as not-for-profit. We tend to distinguish less and less about the activities that for-profits can undertake and which not-for-profits have traditionally undertaken. When funders buy from for-profits, those for-profit organisations actually provide the services and the administration and coordination that we've talked about, and they also provide things like funder engagement and client recruitment, all critically important. But when procurers, so funded agencies, government agencies that buy services from not-for-profits and charities, actually contract with those charities for the administration, the coordination and the services, they actually get much more. Not-for-profits and charities provide the administration, the coordination and the services, but they also provide risk management, clinical governance, funder engagement, community engagement. They deploy, as we've seen, 3.3 million people just in the charity sector. So the not-for-profit sector would deploy far more than that. They also provide free board members, so those people who are jointly and severally responsible for these not-for-profit and charitable corporations often, mostly, provide those services for free. They also provide emergency response and provider of last resort services. They don't turn people away in the way that other organisations with different purposes might. And of course, they recruit clients, but importantly, they provide free advice and input into ministerial roundtables, into committees, and into research that helps to guide policy development. All of those things are absolutely critical to the delivery of services in an efficient and an effective manner in the myriad of activity areas that not-for-profits and charities undertake. So what is the purpose of a charity then? At the end of the day, there are many purposes to a charity, but of course charities, in essence, keep people alive. They educate people and develop educational infrastructure. They protect vulnerable people, and they advocate systemically and individually to support people that need that support and to help them to be able to navigate what can be very complex systems in health, in disability, and in other areas where they operate. They can break destructive cycles to help raise the bar in terms of our community expectations and to drive and support communities to be able to get out of some of the holes that they might find themselves in. They provide medical treatment and personal care and support and assistance to individuals and to families and to groups. They prevent poor outcomes, which is incredibly important, and they also advance Australia's place in the world and advance peace. Charities and not-for-profits don't just work here at home, they work abroad and support some of the major communities that Australia finds itself surrounded by. They provide futures for individuals, families and communities. Indeed, they make a very tangible contribution to the Australian community, one that's both strong economically and important economically, but also more important in terms of the future of the Australian community. So, what's the way forward in terms of getting around this idea of whether or not we want charities and not-for-profit organisations? And I have to say up front that obviously I'm a supporter of these organisations, and I think it's absolutely critical that we retain them. Then I think we need to exercise and undertake economic policy consistency. We have to have a systemic perspective. We have to think about the whole system, and we have to provide investment to be able to make it work. Indeed, industry planning framework and a national reporting structure is absolutely critical to achieving outcomes in relation to this sector. That would include a responsible level of investment in systemic analysis. What is happening? What is driving those outcomes? And how might we improve them? We also need a responsible level of investment in systemic construction. How do we build the system? Not just the individual organisations, not just the procurement scheme, but actually the whole system, and make sure it works. This is particularly an important conception when we understand that Australia is a federation, as we all know, and that the Commonwealth is increasingly providing funding for many of the services that have previously been funded by states and territories. That funding often only buys part of the system of service delivery, and states and territory departments continue to support other parts. And therefore there needs to be systemic construction to make sure all of these things are joined up and operating efficiently and effectively. We also need a responsible level of investment in public sector capacity. The public sector needs to know much more about how the sector operates, how not-for-profits deliver services, what kinds of risks those organisations face, and how best to deliver services in the field. Public sector agencies cannot procure services properly without that understanding. And indeed, they also need to invest in order to raise the bar for public sector personnel who are involved in the procurement process so that they understand things like outcomes reporting much better. There needs to be a genuine partnership structure between governments and the not-for-profit charitable sectors. Such a structure would include things like an executive capacity, that is, that the partnership can actually make determinations and act on those determinations. It would include funding which would support that sector, and it would also provide public transparency so we all knew how it operated. At the end of the day, charities and not-for-profit organisations are absolutely critical to the ongoing building of the Australian community. And I hope some of the comments, some of the suggestions and some of the ideas that have been raised in this lecture strike a chord with you. I'd be delighted to hear from you, to answer questions or to take your comments in relation to some of the content here. But at the end of the day, I still think it's very important for us to appreciate the significance of developing a systemic view of the sector, a view that looks at this sector as being some of the fundamental infrastructure that makes up the Australian community, and that we start to take an institutional view of how we create policy in order to drive not only outcomes for the sector and the people that it looks after, but also the Australian economy. The charitable and not-for-profit sector does have a lot more to give if we treat it properly. Thank you very much.